looking for a way to kill me because you have no room for my word. Why? Because you have no room. The Bible tells us that God himself looked down on our world and saw the wickedness and the evil and the sin and knew that the price was going to be horrible to pay and determined to pay it himself. In order to do that, he came in human form, first as the infant, then the child, then the man Jesus, and walked the face of our earth for close to 30 years. During the last 3.5, he wandered back and forth across Palestine, Galilee, and that region, telling people the truth of God, sharing with them the reality of God, and revealing in word and deed who he is. And he did it in ways that no human being ever before has ever done. And he did it in ways that no human being ever since then has done. He healed. He healed the lame, the blind, the deaf, the mute, the ill, those afflicted with leprosy. He spoke and calmed the storm's roar and the sea's rage. He walked on water. 3 times, the Bible records, he brought the dead back to life again. All of those things that no human being could ever do, and all of them were done that we might know who he is. If you've been following along with us, you know that the majority didn't hear. The majority didn't listen. The majority rejected. They didn't want to know who he was, who he is. And they refused to believe in him. Why? That's a question that plagues my mind, has plagued my mind for 49 years, because it wasn't just the Jews who refused to believe in him, but people all around us in our world even today, in spite of all the miracles, in spite of all the signs, in spite of all the ways, don't believe in him. Why? Do you ever ask that question? Why? Why don't people listen? Why don't they hear? Why don't they see? Why don't they believe? In our verse today, and I think that's why it really caught my attention. In our verse today, Jesus said to the Jews in the crowd that weren't listening, that weren't seeing, that were refusing to believe, he told them why. He said, it's because you have no room. You have no room left in your hearts and your lives to hear the truth and to know who I am. As we look at that statement and the truth that it reveals about us, there's some things that to me that stand out. First of all, it's a ringing indictment. No room. No room. No room. Think about that for a second. What it's saying. Let the thought just kind of reverberate in your mind and your thoughts for a little while. No room. No room for God. No room for the words of God. No room for the truth of God. No room. No room. It's a very simple statement. Oh, but the power of it. It's a ringing indictment on all of us that we allow our lives to be so cluttered that there's no room for God himself. The Jews in the crowd put their trust in their lineage. You've heard it before, but stop and think about it a second. They put everything they had in the belief that because they were direct descendants from Abraham, whom God had chosen, whom God had promised, that they were going to be okay, and they had heaven for them, and it didn't matter how they lived, didn't matter what they did, didn't matter really what they believed anymore. They got it because they were of the lineage of the direct descent from Abraham. That reminds you of people today. Don't worry about the truth of God. You're a good guy. You're going to go to heaven. God's going to look at you and say, you're pretty good. I'll take you. They put their faith in being a good guy. They put their faith in the fact that they, quote, believe there's a God. So, of course, I'm going to go. They put their faith in the fact that they do a few good things, and God's going to look at those good things and said, well, you tried. That's okay. That's okay. With the way we do that, should it surprise us that the Jews put their trust in lineage, in the belief that as a descendant of Abraham, they've got a guarantee the doors of heaven are going to open wide when they come? Jesus said, I don't deny that you came from Abraham physically, but you didn't come from him morally. You didn't come from him spiritually. Unlike Abraham, you don't love God. You don't obey God. You don't serve God. You don't search out for God to find the truth of God. In the 26th chapter of Genesis, in the 5th verse, God said, because Abraham obeyed me, God then chose him and anointed him to be the father of his people. It wasn't because of who his father was, because of the faith that he had and the way he lived it out. Jesus said to those who were trusting in that physical lineage, your spiritual lineage is Satan. Your moral lineage is Satan. Satan was the original father of lies and father of murder, and you're trying to kill me. You're revealing your lineage, and it is not Abraham spiritually and morally, it is Satan himself. And because that's who your lineage is from, because that's the lifestyle that you're choosing to live, you have no room for me. And Abraham did. The worst thing in all the world that can be said of any one of us or anyone we know is that in this life that we were given, we failed to make room for Jesus and the truth that he brought and the truth that he sought to give to us. So our challenge is, let's look at the way we're living today. What role does Christ have in our day-to-day affairs? What time do we give to thinking about him or his words or obeying the concept of God? How much do we spend reflecting the spiritual heritage that Jesus sought to impart? Are we really like the Jews in the crowd? And is Jesus ringing down upon some of us that ringing indictment? No room. No room. No room. Another thing we want to look at here. No room in our world, no room in our thoughts. Think about that for a second. Have you ever stopped to consider the fact that our world doesn't make room for Jesus? Think about it for a second. We've taken him out of just about everything in our world. When he came into our world, there wasn't room for him to be born in an inn like a regular person. He had to go to a stable. We've taken him out of our government. They've removed anything referring to him and his words from the plaques of the courtrooms, from the marquees that used to sit on city property. They've taken him out of our government. He's not a part of the governing factor of our world. They've taken him out of our schools. Teacher can't have a Bible on a desk. Teacher can't mention Jesus Christ. We don't have a Christmas break anymore. It's a winter break. You can't pray. At least if you do, you better not get caught. We've taken him out of our world. Our world has no room for Jesus. Many in the crowd that day had no room for Jesus. They made no place for him in their thoughts. They gave no consideration to the words that he was speaking or the truth that he was uttering or the power that he was revealing. Why? Well, the vast majority of them were focused on getting ahead in the ways Jews got ahead in those days. Adhering to the right words and showing the right things in their life. And all of them were busy being sure that they preserved the status quo because that's what they knew and that's how they could prosper. And so that was the focus of their life. Does that sound familiar? Don't want things to change because it might adversely affect us. And we give ourselves to all of that effort, and our all-consuming thoughts are there. What drives most of us today? What fills your thoughts during the day? Between Sundays, when does Jesus ever come in? When does his word ever echo in your heart or in your mind? What drives our lives? Aren't we busy trying to get ahead or at least preserve what we've got? Don't we fill our lives with our favorite music and with our sports and with our activities and with our jobs and with all of the humdrum pros and cons of life and give ourselves over to those things with little or no regard for Jesus? That's the truth, isn't it? That's the absolute truth. There is no room, often no room, in our hearts, in our thoughts, in our world today for Jesus. It hasn't changed since that day he stood there in the temple and the crowd wanted to kill him and they wanted to argue with him and they made sure that they couldn't hear and that they didn't listen. We're too busy seeking wealth. We're too busy seeking good for our families. We're too busy to listen to the words of Jesus, to let the truth of his words sink into our heart and change our lives. There's no room. There's no room for him in our world today. There's no room for him in our thoughts. One more step. This is the real one. No room in our hearts. No room in our hearts. For the words of Jesus to have any effect, for the truth that he uttered to help us and to bring about godly changes in us. Those words have got to get into our heart, deep inside. One of the worst things and saddest act any of us can do is to make no room in our hearts for Jesus. It's so common to crowd him out. Some here today have never made room for Jesus. Some here will probably never make room for Jesus. Now understand something, because the Bible makes it clear, and I want us to understand it. It's a choice. It is a choice. You and I have chosen what our priorities are. And with those priorities, we put into our hearts the things that reflect that priority. Some of them may be really good things. Probably in a crowd like this, most of them are good things. And they're things that appeal to us and that we want and we desire. And we think we have the right to want them and desire them. And some of them are not selfish things. But they become our overriding priority. And the end result is we don't choose to give Jesus any room in our hearts. Do you remember the story of the rich young ruler that came to Jesus? It's found in the 19th chapter of Matthew, verses 16 to 22. He came to Jesus, and he was a fine young man. You would like him, I would like him, upstanding, moral, good young man, wealthy, good looking. I mean, he had it all. And he came to Jesus and he said, what am I lacking? I want to be right with God. I want to have a place in his kingdom. What am I lacking? When Jesus realized he was serious, he said, take all your property, all your wealth, sell it, give it away to the poor. Come follow me. You know what that young man did? The Bible says he went away sad. Why? Because he didn't have any room to put Jesus in. It was consumed. His heart was consumed with what he already had. And he didn't want to shove any of it aside. He didn't want to get any of it out to make room for Jesus. It was a nice thought to add something more, but not to get rid of what he already had, because that's where his priority was. That's where his heart's desire was. And so he made no room for Jesus. All of this is very intensely personal, you know. Because it doesn't do a bit of good if I could see in your hearts, and I can't. It doesn't do a bit of good for me to look in your heart and say, hey, you got it full. Christ isn't in there. You need to make some room. The personal part of it is, Jesus' words should evoke from each one of us individually the willingness to look, to see how big a role Jesus plays in our life, to see whether there's been any space opened for his word, whether it's growing in us, whether like Abraham, we're actually obeying God during the course of our week, not just on Sunday morning when we feel a little bit and we decide we'll try to be a little better. The real thrust of these words is to say to me, Carl, look in your heart. How big a place have you made for Jesus? Oops, is there nothing there? Is it a little tiny corner off on the side that's reserved for Sundays? To say to you, do the words of Jesus that he spoke to the crowd that day, actually come home to you? And if you could hear him speak, would he be saying to you, why? Because you have no room. And in the lives of most of that crowd, they never made room. And they died without room for Jesus.